Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to read to you another story from the Pacific Northwest, from the First Nation peoples of the Pacific Northwest. The story is called Young Raven and Old Raven. Before I start reading, I'd like you to see these illustrations. The young raven and the old raven. What do you think this story is about? Just by looking at these illustrations. I also want to show you my necklace. It's a raven. What is this that he's carrying? Let's find out. Young raven and old raven. In the beginning of time, all the world slept in a terrible darkness. There was no sun or moon or stars to light the world. There were no humans. There were no animals. Only a few spirits moved uncertainly in this blanket of eternal night. In a cave, at the headwaters of a mighty river, lived the chief of the ancients, Old Raven, and his son, Young Raven. In this cave, Old Raven kept the moon, the sun, and the stars locked away in a large carved wooden box. These were his prized possessions, and he kept them hidden from the world. At the bottom of the chest also lay a mysterious bag that held what Old Raven called life. 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 Through the centuries, Young Raven had been an obedient and patient son, but he grew weary of the darkness. He longed to see the treasures in his father's wooden chest. One day, Young Raven said to Old Raven, "Oh, father, you sit upon that great carved box day after day, guarding treasures you call the sun and the moon and the stars. Please, could I see these wondrous treasures?" But Old Raven sent his son away. "No!" he barked. "These are my treasures. They were mine in the beginning, and they will be mine until the end of time. No one will ever see them." Young Raven was disappointed. But soon he stood before his father again. "Oh, father," pleaded Young Raven, "please, let me have just a little glimpse of your treasure, please." Old Raven grew angry and turned his son away. "No!" shouted Old Raven. "Never! Never!" Once again, Young Raven was sorely disappointed. But he was even more determined to see what was in his father's chest. So he thought and thought until an idea came to him. Young Raven waited until Old Raven had eaten a big supper and taken his usual place upon the great carved chest. Old Raven's belly was full, and soon his head began to nod. Young Raven approached his sleepy father and said, "Oh, you are so tired, father. You're so weary. Let me guard the chest. I'll protect your treasures, and you can rest." Old Raven said nothing, but he climbed slowly down from the chest, gathered his robe about his shoulders, and disappeared into the depths of the cave. Soon, young Raven heard his father snoring. Young Raven crept to the chest. Standing on his tiptoes, he eased open the massive wooden lid and slid it quietly to the floor. Then young Raven peered into the box. "What wonderful things to behold," young Raven explained softly as his eyes rested first upon the sun, then the moon, and then the stars. The brightest treasure was the sun. The fascinated young Raven plucked it carefully out of the chest and held it up. Can you imagine the young Raven holding up the sun? He marveled at its brightness. Young Raven was so pleased with the sun that he carried it outside the cave. And for the first time, light touched the world. Young Raven began to play with his shiny treasure. He rolled the sun on the ground. He tossed it in the air and caught it again and again. He threw the sun up and caught the sparkling globe as it fell back on earth. Each time young Raven threw the sun up, it flew higher and higher, but he was so excited he did not notice it. Finally, young Raven heaved the sun upward with all his strength. It soared into the sky and it became stuck there. Young Raven was frightened. He knew his father would punish him terribly for losing the sun. He rushed back to the cave, grabbed the moon from the chest, and carried it outside. The moon was not as big nor as bright as the sun, but young Raven hoped to knock the sun down with the moon and return them both to the great chest before his father awoke. Alas, the moon only struck the sun and bounced across the sky where it stuck fast. Young Raven was frantic. He had lost the sun. He had lost the moon. He bolted into the cave. He scooped up all the stars and ran out again. Young Raven began to fling stars one at a time at the sun and the moon, but the stars also became caught in the sky. Young Raven had only a handful of stars left. In frustration, he hurled them all, scattering the stars across the heavens to form what people now call the Milky Way. Back in the cave, young Raven peered sadly into that great chest. It was empty, except for the little buckskin bag that held life. Carefully, he picked up the bag and carried it outside. Maybe I can use this to retrieve the sun, the moon, and the stars, thought young Raven. If he could, he might escape the awful wrath of his father. Suddenly, young Raven heard old Raven begin to stir. When old Raven saw light streaming into his cave, he knew right away what had happened. He rushed to the great chest and saw that it was open and empty. Old Raven flew into a rage. He screamed and ran outside to find his son. Young Raven was terrified. He darted behind his father and into the cave. Old Raven was fast on his heels. In and out of the cave they ran, round and round they went, until at last young Raven scurried down the side of the mountain. He could hear his father's angry screams echoing behind him. Young Raven ran and ran until he thought his heart would burst. As he sped down a dried-up riverbed, young Raven caught his foot on a gnarled root and fell. His sharp beak was driven in among the river rocks. By this time, the exhausted old Raven had given up the chase. Young Raven tried to stand, but he could not. His beak was caught fast in the stones. Young Raven pulled gently at first, then he began to twist and tug harder and harder, but still he could not pull his beak free. In the struggle, young Raven dropped the buckskin bag he had taken from his father's chest. It fell upon the stones and burst open. Life spilled over the riverbed. Still, young Raven struggled to escape, unaware that the stones around him had begun to change. They started to grow and look a little bit like humans. Small, round stones turned into small, round people. Long, narrow stones became tall, skinny people. By the time young Raven had finally pulled his beak free, all the stones had transformed into humans. Young Raven stared at these first beings in wonder and surprise. Some of the humans looked in fright. Some of the humans looked in fright at young Raven and ran into the forest. There, in the twilight and shadows, they became the deer, the bear, the elk, and all of the four-footed creatures of the world. Other humans jumped into the air and flapped their arms. They turned into the birds of the world. Still, other humans fled into the ocean to hide in its cool green depths. They became the fish of the sea. The bravest humans stood their ground, and they became the ancestors of the first Indians in the beginning of the world. I hope you enjoyed this story.